Thank you so much for coming out this evening, and I would stand where Dan was standing, but I was afraid you wouldn't see me. So I figured I needed to be up here, but I kind of move around a lot, so I couldn't quite get behind the pulpit either. So it's a beautiful, beautiful day, and it's I just really appreciate you taking this time, especially on a weekend, to be here. And I want to thank the Rivermont Church and how much hospitality. Diane's been incredible in getting all the arrangements together, and Dan's been so gracious. So thank you so much for all that you've done to host me here. It's been a real privilege to come. I am tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up Southern Baptist, and I wanted to be a pastor. And this was, a while ago. I think these barriers have broken down a little bit, but I really, really wanted, I didn't even know that I wanted to be a pastor, but I was writing sermons in my room when I was a little kid. So, most people, when they're doing that, it's usually because they're planning on becoming pastors. But I was writing sermons as a little kid down, and I went to Bible school and thought, well, maybe I can figure out what this is all about, why this is happening. And then when I was in college, I became Presbyterian. I became part of the mainline church. And for me, it was just such grace that happened at that point. It was like a flood of mercy. And I bring this up because I'm not one of these people who are going to come up and tell you that the mainline church or the Presbyterian church, or I'm not going to say that church is dead, because that hasn't been my experience. And I see every day where young adults are being affected and transformed by congregations and by loving communities. And so that's really my starting point. That's where I begin. I often get tired as a pastor of having someone come into town from out of town telling me how irrelevant we are and how the church is never going to last. And I think that the church is going to last. I think there's something incredible, something vital here in our congregations. But I also know from going around the country, from speaking to different congregations, from research that I've been doing, from research that I've been reading, that if we add 20 years to the people in the pews now, church is going to look a lot different in 20 years. If we begin to look at the average age of Presbyterians, 61, we need to start thinking about a faith that goes from generation to generation. All throughout the Old Testament, we hear about a faith that goes from generation to generation. And as Christians, we pick that up and we know that's what we are to do. So I loved what Dan said when he was talking about the present-future visioning. Present-future visioning. That's what I want to do a little bit today, this evening. And what we'll do is we'll talk about three different things. We're going to talk about the landscape of many young adults today. What do their lives look like? Our lives look like? The clock's ticking on me, really. I'm 39. And when I use the term young adult, I'm using it to mean people in their 20s and 30s, but it's a difficult term. And so if you use the term in your churches, you might be confusing, because the young adult book section in the bookstore is for 12-year-olds. And people think of young adult in that sense. I use it because it's sort of a sociological term. But even some sociologists are talking about young adults being 45. If you went up to a 45-year-old in your congregation and called them a young adult, they would say, "Oh my, I'm not young at all." But when I use the term this evening and tomorrow, I'll be talking about people in their 20s and 30s. When we look at the landscape of young adults, we'll be doing that. We'll also be looking at some of the barriers that we might have in our churches, some of the things that we might unintentionally set up in our congregations, which act as barriers to young adult ministry. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the good things that are happening. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions as well. I just looked at the time. I gotta talk fast. I talk about church as tribal church because it's just a good metaphor. It's not a perfect metaphor. It breaks down all the time. But I talk about it as tribal church because I read a book. It was called Urban Tribes. And it was about a guy who went out to eat with a group of his friends every Thursday night. And as they went out, as they ate together, as they shared this meal together, he noticed over the course of the year that this community formed together. And they began to share not just meals, but they began to share concerns, and they began to share grievances. When they broke up with each other or broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend, they were there talking about the breakup. When they lost a job, they helped each other out with different things, with sometimes money or places to stay, or when they needed health care, they needed to get to the doctors, they helped each other get to the doctor. They were there for one another, and he called this an urban tribe. And as I was reading that, I thought, you know, that's what our churches do. That's what our congregations do. That's what we do when we're at our best. And so I began to think about, what if we started acting like that, not just with older generations, but with also younger generations? What if we began to think of our congregations as tribes, in the sense that we have these relationships and these connections, that we join together and we connect with one another? You might be asking yourself, why would younger generations need a tribe? We'll talk about that. There are certain characteristics of young adults, things that we go through that not everyone understands. Oftentimes when we think about young adult ministry, I do this, I do college student ministry a lot, and when I think about what would be good campus ministry, sometimes I don't ask the students, but I think to myself, what did I like when I was their age? And that works a little bit, but it only gets you so far, because each generation is formed by the events of their generation. Each generation is formed by particular cultural events, political events. Each generation is a little bit different. And so we cannot always go into thinking what would work with young adults by thinking what would I want when I was a young adult, but we have to begin listening to the context, the landscape of most young adults, begin hearing their voices in our own communities. I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening, and many of these things, when I first wrote Tribal Church, I talked about there being economic understanding in our congregations, and when I started this, people would say, that doesn't make any sense at all. And now it's been a few years, and all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, so it's not so difficult to talk about. But there are three things that have happened in this landscape of young adults. Three things that we'll talk about: economics, finances, and commitments. Three things. When we think about, employment, finances, and commitments. Employment, finances, and commitments. When we think about young adults, one of the major things to remember is how employment is shaping where they're at. The job opportunities for many young adults include short-term jobs. Young people make up half of the temporary labor force in our country. When I went to go get a job, my first year out of college, I was very excited, and so I went and applied for all kinds of jobs. I couldn't get anything, so I went to Kelly temporary agencies, because that's what all my friends did. And we assumed that if we went to the temporary agency and if we worked really, really, really hard at our temporary job, then maybe we could get a regular full-time job. Maybe this could happen. And so that's what we would do. Well, somewhere along the line, it seems like people began to understand this, and companies began to see what was happening, and maybe it made more sense for them to have it keep happening. And so temporary work became very, very available for many young adults. And most young adults who are coming out of college right now, if they can find a job, it's often a temporary job, or it's a job where their tenure is expected to last about 2.7 years. About 2.5 years. And many times, at least it's been in the last decade or so, the young have been the first people to get laid off. I had someone read my book at first before it went to publication, and they said, that can't be right. It's retired people. Retired people are the ones that get laid off. So I did some more research and saw, no, it's usually the young who get laid off first. Employment, it affects the way that we see our lives. We're moving every 2.5 years. Oftentimes, we're moving away from our family. We're moving away from the place where we grew up. And we're starting to become fragmented all over the country. Americans have always been a nomadic sort of people.